All right, everybody, let's get started with our second talk for tonight. There's several strategies for controlling weeds in gardens. This includes a simple method that harnesses the power of the sun and a dark covering to eradicate weeds. And here to describe this innovative approach is Emily Howe. Emily is the Extension Horticulture Agent in Ward County. She holds a degree in environmental sciences and a master's in land resources and environmental sciences. Emily enjoys gardening and spending time outside. She says the favorite thing she grew last season was okra and cucumbers. So that was a favorite thing you grew, but
Yeah.
not the favorite thing you ate, because it couldn't be okra. Couldn't have been your
Oh,
favorite
it's
thing to eat.
always okra. It's always going to be
Are you
okra.
serious? Okra looks good, but the flowers are beautiful. It's a great ornamental, but I don't know. My
You,
wife eats that, not me.
you just don't know how to cook it right, Colin.
I know. Like, okay, share a recipe with me tomorrow, okay?
Got you.
Anyhow, Emily, welcome to the forums.
So thank you so much for having me. This is not as ominous as it sounds. But yeah, we're going to talk about the dark side of weeding. So, uh, first thing I want to mention is there's a difference between oculation and solarization. So, oculation, the word occult, or the first part of this word, actually comes from the Latin word, which means to hide. So you're essentially hiding the soil from the sun. So you're going to use a dark plastic or some other type of material like the cardboard that Kelsey mentioned, or silage tarps, old billboards, things like that. You're just going to block the light out and you're not heating the soil at all with this method. And solarization is a bit different. So you use a clear plastic tarp, and it needs to be around that 2 to 6 milliliter or millimeter, sorry, thickness, because you want the light to be able to actually penetrate through that tarp. So there you're going to be trapping the heat and it creates a greenhouse effect. So that greenhouse effect is going to trap the heat and moisture, and it's going to force the weed seed to germinate. And once it starts to grow, it's actually going to get too hot and it's going to burn. So um, the plants will uh, just die out that way. So why oculation? Why this method as opposed to solarization? So the first is soil microorganisms. So Kelsey talked a little bit about the benefits of no-till and soil microorganisms. But oculation can be a little bit more beneficial for them as well because it doesn't heat the soil. So when you're heating the soil, you have to be cautious that those microbes are only able to withstand a certain amount of heat. Um, so the rule of thumb is around 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're not able to control that heat whenever you use solarization, so you don't know how hot that soil is getting. And a lot of studies that I've seen, solarization gets hotter than oculation, but also they have seen decreases in those soil microorganisms in the solarization process rather than the oculation process. Some of these studies did take place in warmer climates, so it could not be as big of a problem for North Dakota, but it's just something to keep in the back of your head.
So the other thing with oculation is you can also reuse the plastic. So solarization, the plastic tends to be a little bit more one use plastic because of how thin it is when you account in for weather and other things. And it tears a lot easier and it's just more of a one use plastic, where oculation, you can reuse the plastic over and over again. You're also looking at something that might be in your backyard or in your storage already. I have a ton of blue tarps from having to move or paint or do things like that. So it's something that I have already, and I'm not having to go out and buy new materials. Um, and then once again, you're depleting that resource, you're depleting the access to the sun for the weeds. So if they don't have that sun, they're not able to photosynthesize. If they're not able to photosynthesize, they're not getting the sugars and the energy that they need in order to grow. And then this is just a picture of some really healthy looking soil. That deep color is what we like to see, that deep brown. There it goes. Okay, so the process is pretty straightforward. You're going to mow it short, cover it with a dark tarp, weigh it down, wait, and then remove. Pretty easy as far as weed control methods go. So this is a picture of what my garden in my backyard looked like 2 to 3 years before it became mine. Um, as you can see, there's a lot of different weeds growing in there. It was not mowed down, it was not taken care of. There were a mixture of both perennial and annual weeds. There was a lot of thistle, a whole lot of thistle. That was probably the biggest weed that we found, and there was just different forms of thistle. You can see along that fence line, that was all Canada thistle, which is really difficult to get rid of. And then um, I had probably every flavor of thistle imaginable in that spot. So this was a little bit later. You want to mow the area down really short. So like take your mower blade and lower it down as far as you can get it and mow that. You don't really care that you're going to be scalping the soil because we don't want anything in that area to begin with. So this is a little high. I would mow it down shorter than this, but this was about the height that it was mowed down to. And yeah, you can still see there's those patches of Canada thistle and other grasses that had just completely taken over this bed. There was nothing desirable in there. So you take out the tarp, and I covered it with a black plastic tarp. You can use other material. There is a landscape fabric on one side because I needed just a little bit more to cover my garden bed area. And that black actually absorbs the light. It's not reflecting it back or anything like that. It absorbs and holds the light. You'll also notice that I used landscaping bricks rather than staples because I did not want to puncture holes in that plastic. If I had holes in the plastic, that's going to give a escape route for weeds to poke their heads through, and also gives a little bit of access to some light. And I wanted to eliminate that as much as possible. So the goal of this is I wanted to get the plastic as close to that soil as possible. So that's where the mowing short, the weighing down, all that sort of things. The other thing to note with this is you're also excluding some of the water that's going in from the spring. And I'll touch a little bit more on that later, but it's not something to worry about. One thing that I did notice is the birds really loved this because the water would collect on top of the tarp and then they had their own bird bath. So that was really exciting for them. The next thing you're going to think about is timing. So spring versus winter. Do I want to put my fabric out in the spring or in the winter? If I put it out in the spring, I am allowing all that snow to melt down into the soil, and then I'm going to cover it with that plastic, and that water that has melted down into the soil is not going to be able to evaporate out of the soil, which is why I didn't worry too much about the spring rains or anything like that. I applied my tarp around this time last year when I did this, and I wasn't too worried about water or moisture levels because the snow had already melted down into it. But you can also apply it before that first snowfall. So if you put it out in the winter and then let the snow come, it's really just one of those things where you're going to choose the best timing for you, and it could change versus based on the season. So if I'm expecting a certain type of season, I might change when I lay out my tarp based off of that. Usually you want to do it before planting, but sometimes people will use this method to terminate their cover crops. So are you wanting to terminate a crop that's growing in there without having to till it down? Or are you just trying to clear out an area for planting? And then, like I said, sometimes people will use it for that cover crop termination, uh, rather than using herbicides or tilling to control those. The other thing with timing is how many weeks are you going to need to kill off some of those really frustrating weeds. So these are just a list of a couple different weeds from the Virginia Extension. They did an experiment where they covered several different plots with their tarps, and they looked at how long it took for their weeds to die. And the tarps were removed after 2, 4, 6, and then 16 weeks, I believe. Um, and different weeds took different amounts of time. So things like field bindweed and yellow wood sorrel took way longer than something like black medic. Black medic only took about 2 weeks to kill, and dandelions took a lot longer. So looking at that, uh, what do you have in your area? What are you trying to get rid of? What do you think is the most prominent? For me, it was a thistle. So I needed to have it down for at least 4 weeks. Um, by the time that I removed my tarp, it had been probably 6 to 8 weeks. It had just been sitting out there. And the reason why you want it to sit out for extended periods of time is, like I said, you're depleting the plants from the sun. So they're not able to photosynthesize and create those sugars. That forces the plant to use their reserves that they have in their roots. So if you have a really long taproot or a plant with a really long taproot, like a dandelion, then it has to go longer to deplete that food reserves before they can actually die. Um, so just something to keep in mind there is like the longer the taproot, the more stubborn the weed is, the longer you may have to keep that tarp out and that process going. The other thing you have to kind of think about is seeds and rhizomes. So seeds like the dandelion seeds, those can sometimes blow in. So even though you have your garden and you're like, oh, cool, I got rid of all these weeds, you're still going to have the chance of weeds blowing in. So it's not a completely weed-free garden. Other things like rhizomes, we did have some grass encroach from the lawn into the garden. And that was just something that you have to take into consideration whenever you're looking at clearing out that area. Another thing that we noticed was the rhizomes would send out, if it was a weed and it was under the tarp, they would send out the rhizomes to try and escape the tarp. Because if they got one little plant out of that covering, then they were able to um, really just take off and then send supplies back to like the mother plant. So going with that, you also have dormancy and perennial weeds. So some weed seeds have a 2-year average dormancy, so you might not see them this year, but next year they might come in. So oculation is also really good because it's going to be depleting that seed bank and depleting those resources. So you're forcing those seeds to do everything that they can to try to survive. And sometimes that can mean using all of the materials that they have, even if they don't want to. So what were the results for my garden? That is what it looks like when we took the fabric off. So as you can see, there's some of those little white squiggle things that you'll see around there. Those were those rhizomes that I mentioned trying to escape that fabric and try to get out of there. So it really did clear out that area. It really did help a lot with removing a bulk of the really nasty weeds that we had. And then I was able to put out that fabric and I had a really nice garden. I did use fabric because I wanted to try and keep that weed suppression down. Like I said, I had a lot of really nasty weeds, and on that right-hand side, you can still see that I had some thistles popping through in different spots. And even in my that third row from the right, it was my Asian mustard row, and it still had like grasses and other things that would pop through occasionally. Um, so it didn't completely eradicate all of the weeds, but it did do a lot to control most of those weeds that would have completely taken over my garden. So what are the pros and cons? So pros, it's low tech, very simple. I put out a piece of plastic, I left it out there for a while, and I pulled it back. I was done. There was no tilling, there was no chemicals. I didn't have to think about, oh my goodness, how many worms am I cutting in half? Or um, is this chemical going to cause impacts? Because I didn't use any of those. I wasn't heating the soil, so I didn't have to think about the soil microorganisms. And it did weaken the perennial weeds, roots, and it did kill the annual weeds. So great results on that end. Some of the cons is the time. I did have to wait a really long time before I was able to put anything in the ground. So you do have to kind of take that into consideration. How much time am I willing to put this out there? Am I running out of time? If you go out and you're putting your tarp on your garden area now, you're probably going to have enough time. If you wait until mid-May, you're probably not going to have enough time. There is a little bit of labor involved, putting out the tarp, moving the rocks around, staking it down on the edges, and all of those sorts of things. There is that labor aspect involved. Um, Finding a large enough tarp, if you're looking at a really large area, can be difficult to find a tarp that's large enough, or you might have to go out and get multiple tarps. That's where something like a old billboard, that might be something that you can utilize if you can find one of those. It's not a permanent solution. You do have weeds that come back. You do have um, different opportunities where you may have to put it out again and kill the weeds again. Uh, we did have to pull out all of the weed roots. So those, like I said, those white things, we did have to pull those out. We didn't want them to come back. And so we were pulling out a bunch of weed roots, and you still have to do some weeding. Um, and it is also season dependent. So kind of depending on where you are and what you're trying to do, it can be a little bit of season dependent. And then that is my contact information if you have any questions. And this is some of the publications and resources that I pulled some stuff from.
Okay, here's one for you, Emily. Did that Virginia Tech study that had to show how long it takes quackgrass to die? It's got to take a long time, huh?
Uh, I don't remember seeing it on that list. They had a list
Like,
of like 20, 30 weeds that they were looking at. So I just pulled some that I knew were common, but I don't remember seeing quackgrass on there because I would have included that one.
and where'd you get your tarp, by the way?
I went to a uh, big box store
Okay,
and I bought a tarp
okay.
and I grabbed the largest size that they had in black.
And did you use it one time or have you repeated the process?
So I've only used it this one time. Um, I still have that tarp, so I can reuse it and repeat that process if I wanted to. Right now, my garden isn't looking like it needs to, and I probably wouldn't because I have garlic planted in certain spots, and I wouldn't want to cover the tarp and accidentally kill my garlic.
Okay. And when you selected that black plastic, what were you looking for? Like, is it like earlier we talked about you should allow for some percolation of moisture, but you didn't want that in this case.
No, I didn't want that at all. I wanted it to be a good, thick black plastic. The main thing that I was concerned in was size. I wanted to make sure that it was large enough to cover most of my garden bed. I didn't want to have to do a weird jigsaw piecing together of black plastic. Um, the fabric that I had that I used for my garden, it was not a plastic-based fabric. It was a true like fabric. I could cut into it. I couldn't, and it doesn't fray, whereas there are some landscape fabrics and garden fabrics that you would want to use like that propane torch in because it is more plastic based. And I think that could have been some of the reason why the right side of my garden had some more weed issues than the left side of my garden is because that was the space that I ran out of tarping.
Okay. Now, would this approach work in a more shady garden?
Yes, because you're still going to be depriving the weeds of sun. It's that 100% knocking out the sun for the weeds that is what's detrimental to them.
Okay, now there's talk about I remember Don Kensler gave a talk about a year ago about the benefits of clear plastic mulching for watermelons, and I've talked about using various plastic mulches for cucumbers.
Yeah.
So then one person has a question: if the clear plastic's harming microorganisms, should we remove it after the plants get growing?
So that studies that I talked about with the microorganisms was all about length of time. So by the time that our cucumbers and our melons that we're wanting to remove that plastic, it isn't causing those issues to the microorganisms. The other thing you're having to keep in mind is unless you're planting like fields of them, they're probably not causing a lot of issues. Microorganisms do move throughout the soil. So you could, like if you're looking at just a row of cucumbers or a row of melons, those microorganisms are able to move around as needed.
Okay. Well, that's a relief. Need to kill those precious microorganisms.
Nope, we want
Uh,
those.
yeah. What else we got here? Well, here's a botanical question, Emily. See how sharp you are here. Is
Mm,
dandelion an annual weed or a perennial weed?
I believe it's a perennial, Tom, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Way to go. You hit a home run there. And here's a lot of
Yeah.
these people, Emily, are asking questions about, can we use your strategy? Like, since it works so good, can't we just use it every April?
Yeah. If you wanted to. Like I said, it's going to kind of depend on what you're growing or what you're trying to do. Like I said, I'm not going to do it this year because I have garlic in my garden bed and I planted that in the fall so that it would be good and ready this summer. And so I don't want to cover it and prevent the sunlight from getting to my garlic because I don't want to deplete those resources. Um, if I need to repeat it, I might try and do it this fall and do like September to November or something.
How about, okay, now you started from scratch. You had a disaster and you just wiped it all out and, without chemicals. Now this person's got a perennial flower garden and it's weeds. Could you like put a blanket of landscape fabric over it and just poke out holes in the fabric where the perennial flowers are? It'd be a lot of work.
Yeah, that would be a lot of work, Tom. You could. I mean, that option is there. I would probably do it in the springtime when they're starting to emerge, so I'm not having to wrangle a whole bunch of blanket flower under a piece of fabric and I kind of know where they're situated. Or in the fall, if you leave your flower heads where you can chop them back some and see where that root face is. But yeah, that is an option that you can do is to put that out over. Um, I would consider personally moving the perennials because they can be moved, move them to one section, clear out the area and put them back in.
Yeah, it makes sense to me too. How about by using this approach? Okay, this is kind of a hard question. Are you saying those rhizomatous microorganisms, they're never going to go away if you use this approach?
It's just another hurdle you have to jump with the weeds. I
Okay.
mean, never say never, but it's just another hurdle.
Okay. How about using this person, like their husband uses straw around the tomatoes, straw, but the weeds come through. What do you think? What should we do about that?
Pull the weeds.
All the weeds. Great
If
idea.
it's just around the tomatoes, if it's not that many. I don't know if you guys saw in the picture, I have straw around my potatoes. I mound my potatoes and planted it to the straw so I don't have to dig really deep for my potatoes. And I would occasionally get um, those grass type weeds around my potatoes and I just pulled them. They came out real easy.
Right. That's like weeds is therapeutic, as we talked
Yeah.
about earlier. It's not, it's okay to have a few weeds. We're not talking about sterilizing our nature and have like no weeds. We just
That's
got
never gonna happen,
it's
Tom.
just not, yeah, exactly. We're,
Never
you
gonna
know,
happen.
milk plants. I mean, like, what are we talking about? Like, you're gonna get some weeds, gonna get some nature, some worms, some microorganisms. It's okay. It's all good. It's all natural. How about, does anybody else have any other questions that they want to type in their the Q&A box here? Okay, I've heard of solarization, but I never heard of occultillation or whatever that is. So I learned a
Yeah.
lot tonight. I really appreciate that. And you
Yeah.
know what, Emily, the nice thing is that seeing's believing. We saw your before and after. It's
No,
for real. And
no,
even
it is.
okra can grow in these soils too. It might not. How about that? Wow, up
Yes.
in the North Country. So there's got to be
Yeah.
something special about what you're doing up there.
And my okra did very, very well, Tom. I have a bunch left over in my freezer if you want some.
You know what? I have no room in my freezer right now. Sorry about that, but thanks for the offer. I greatly appreciate it. Um, Emily, thank you for the presentation. I learned a lot. We all did. Thank you.
Thanks.